Hi, my name's Paul Gerrard and I'm in the lucky position of having been a recipient of Dr. Martinick's hair transplant using the Martinick technique. I've had 2 hair transplants and we've achieved in that time optimum density, and since the hair transplant lots of people have said to me, Paul, what is the Martinick technique and how did it come about? And to answer these questions, who better to ask than Dr. Jenny Martinick.
Paul, lovely to see you again. I was introduced to hair transplants around 25 years ago. And at that time, they were pretty obvious and undignified. I mean, these transplants were made with plugs of hair, and over time, the plugs would sit there vertically and there would be no surrounding hair. And so we coined the phrase plug ugly.
So, I presume you had to do something about that.
I'm a curious person. And over the years, I wondered whether I would actually be able to improve the techniques for the benefit of my patients. And so, because I wanted to create a natural hairline, I wanted to get the maximum density that I could, and I also wanted to make sure that the poor little follicles, of which there's a maximum of about 6,000, would survive.
I suppose you could say you were driven by scientific curiosity to find the best solution.
Yes,
Okay.
and observation.
Right. And that led you to creating a 10-point plan that defines the Martinick technique. And I believe the first of those is the basic conceptualization. Can you talk a little about that?
To actually get an idea of what the hairs were doing on the scalp, I had to have shaved scalps with magnification, so I could actually understand the direction of the hair, the angles of the hair, the orientation of the hair with regards to the way the hair was flowing. And so it was over time that I realized that nature was made up of a mixture of organization and chaos. Over time, I could almost work out where the next hair ought to be, or the next hair follicle, just by understanding nature.
Jenny, you mentioned over time. How long have you been at this?
Over 20 years. Half my waking time was probably involved with thinking these out of the box, thinking new concepts.
What's the science and the biology behind the Martinick technique?
I had to think about the layers of the skin, how thick it is, it varies in different people. I had to think about the blood supply to the area. I had to think what the hairs are doing in the skin. I had to think about what the hairs are doing in relation to each other. So there's many bits that come into what some people might call basic science, but in actual fact it's a topic that a lot of people don't even think about.
Having done a bit of research on a hair transplant, and you may be doing the same right now, I discovered that a hair transplant and a hair transplant are actually 2 completely different things. A car may be a car, but of course 2 cars have got very different power, engine and capability. And time management is one of those areas that make the Martinick technique special.
It's really, really important to understand your resources, understand your staff, and train them to a point where whatever the size of the procedure you choose to do, you need to be able to complete that inside 8 hours, because it's been shown by many researchers that hair follicles start dying of natural causes if they are out of the body for more than 8 hours.
Right.
If I go back to your point about cars and cars, hair transplants are not all the same. It's a bit like thinking that you want a mansion built, and you choose between the master builder or the handyman. The handyman will do it cheaper, but you won't get the results. And so you do have to pay a little bit more for quality.
And often that represents best value for money, because you can be paying for the after effects of the handyman's work for years and years and years, trying to correct and make good.
Well, the problem with a lot of the hair transplants is single follicle grafting that is being done at the minute using various harvesting techniques. Often the hairs are transected or injured. Now, I know from my research that goes back in 2000, 2001, There was a Dr. Bill Parsley and myself who completed 22 patients over 18 months. At the end of 18 months, where the hairs were not damaged, 98% of the hairs grew. Where the hairs were damaged, as little as 9% of the hairs grew.
I imagine staff training is therefore a key element.
It's absolutely imperative. First of all, you've got to know what each of your staff is capable of, whether it's how many per minute you cut, how many you place. You've also got to make sure that they're getting enough exposure so that unless you really are a full-time hair transplant clinic, or at least be able to offer your staff at least 4 procedures per week, they really won't hone their skills.
Right, to update and keep everything current.
It's like playing the piano.
Now, some viewers will think, this is great, I need to know a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the surgery. So what defines the Martinick technique as being different from a surgical point of view?
Okay, there's a few bits there. Some are sort of a bit like trade secrets, if you don't mind. But essentially, there is different instrumentation so that I can get the follicles closer together. I respect the skin and I minimize the trauma by limiting the size of the hole, by limiting the depth, but also I've had to create new instruments to deal with this and then train the staff in the 2-touch technique so they only handle each graft twice while placing.
And the 2-touch technique is integral to the Martinick technique?
Yes, it is. It's trademarked also.
When I had my hair transplants, I was really struck by the artistry of the Martinick technique, the understanding of wave, movement, curl, orientation of hair, how to get it to all work together. Apart from that, the artistry, there's a lot of maths involved. Not my greatest subject. Can you tell me a little bit about the maths of the Martinick technique?
Before you even start on the procedure, during the consult, it is imperative to find out what type of groupings and what percentages of them there are in the donor area at the back of your head, because this will have an effect on how we're going to plan the procedure. The same as the colour of your hair with regards to your skin. That has an effect on what we're going to do too. So we're really working out the area that needs to be transplanted, the number of follicles you require, given the groupings of the 1, the 2, the 3. So if you've only got 1s and 2 hairs, it makes life much more difficult, and we have to take that into consideration before we even start. And along the way, once you start getting feedback from the staff, because my staff and I continuously are in communication during the procedure, then I will make alterations at that time. But going back to your previous, where you mentioned artistry, artistry is absolutely crucial along with the recipient sites or the recipient area, because it is only by understanding the various curl, orientation, direction, no straight lines in nature, and the list goes on, can you actually mimic nature and make a hair transplant that is absolutely invisible.
You mentioned earlier training, and the doctors that practice the Martinick technique, Dr. Kotai, Dr. Zinn, Dr. Alia, I imagine as doctors they are scientifically orientated. How are you able to train in the artistry?
It takes at least 2 years.
Hence the reason that it's important to be doing 4 transplants a week.
Yes.
And this, I believe, is where many clinics fall down, because they may be doing 1 or 2 a month if they're lucky.
Well, the other thing is that these concepts are really not taught at international meetings. There are many, many doctors out there who are undertrained, unqualified, because they have gone to a meeting and the thought process is, oh, this looks easy. And in fact, each of the doctors you have just mentioned, when they first came, for the first 2 or 3 months, they think it looks easy. But when they get into it, they're horrified by how complicated it is to have a beautiful result.
So once you've got that artistry and that science and all of the elements that make up the Martinick technique, how important is it to have the latest technology and the best instrumentation?
Paul, I'm going to be giving away trade secrets if I talk on this. My instruments are finer so that the holes are smaller, therefore the holes can be closer together, therefore I can increase the density, and they're part of my...
Part of the private armoury.
Yes.
That makes it the Martinick technique. Part of that system is the emphasis on the recipient site.
Throughout the years, despite all the arguments regarding harvesting, I have always said that the most important part of the hair transplant is the recipient area. How the hairs are put on the scalp, their angles, their orientation, their direction, their relationship to each other, understanding organization and chaos and blending them together. That is what is directly related to patient satisfaction.
So assuming you've got good donor hair, it's actually the artistry into the site, the placement of the grafts, that makes or breaks the results of a hair transplant.
Absolutely.
I know that Dr. Sarah, Dr. Zin, and Dr. Alia are all now practitioners of the Martinick technique. How are they getting on?
Paul, the Martinick technique is complicated, but I am happy to say that they have all mastered it.
So the future is in safe hands.
This is my legacy.
And I also understand that as part of the legacy, you've trademarked the Martinick technique.
Yes, I was encouraged back in 2008 to actually apply to the lawyers to have the Martinick technique and the two-touch technique trademarked. And yes, they are.
Essentially, having a system and having a training means that you can more easily predict good results with the Martinick technique.
And control, yes, you're quite right.
Well, the final thing I like to say, Jenny, is thank you, because you have undertaken 2 procedures. The second one increased the density once the healing had taken place after the first procedure. I'm thrilled with my results, and I think the Martinick technique helps make the results more dependable and more reliable.
Well, I get the greatest joy out of seeing my patients with their invisible hair transplants. And that was my aim, that's my pledge in my life, is to make hair transplants better.